Cowboy Bebop, Metal Gear Solid, The Simpsons, Batman the Animated Series, and pretty much nearly every anime that has ever come out all share one thing in common: the shared influence of a particular show that has been running for almost 50 years now, and yet no one's heard of it. Lupin III, otherwise known as... well, that's actually the original name for the show, but outside of Japan there were many problems with that name, due to the fact that the name Lupin came from Maurice Leblanc's timeless classic, Arsène Lupin. Copyright issues emerged with that intellectual property, forcing the name of the show to be changed to Wolf or Rupin in the States. However, in 2012, Arsène Lupin had finally entered public domain, allowing for the name Lupin III to be used worldwide. The creator of Lupin III, who went by the name Monkey Punch, wanted to create a series that would aim to examine traits of Leblanc's character, while giving it a more Japanese-esque flair. The original story back in 1909 that this character is based on was the gentleman thief who helped establish the trope of the crime-solving mastermind who's also good with the ladies and has the charisma that you'll find in any modern picaresque style story. He helped popularize that villainous yet charming thief who always somehow ended up winning, either selfishly or in some cases even being altruistic. Arsène was mostly depicted as a mysterious entity. Even the reader wasn't fully aware if he was truly heroic. The contrast between his gentleman demeanor and villainous actions proved to be very interesting. It was truly up to the reader to decide who was and wasn't the hero. Arsène garnered quite a reputation for himself as the master of disguise. He even got his opportunity to face off against the one and only Sherlock Holmes himself. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Herlock. Man, copyright's a bitch. The point is, this character was a predecessor for Lupin III, and thanks to the show, his image is still kept to some relevancy to this very day. Although that is debatable since, like I said earlier, people don't even talk about Lupin III anymore. Here, have a seat, make some popcorn, let's dive into the greatness that is Lupin III, and hopefully by the end I can convince you that this show is amazing. Lupin III currently has around 6 different shows, if we're counting spin-offs, and over a dozen movies. The show that I'd like to look at firstly is Lupin III Part 1, otherwise known as the Green Jacket series, as referenced by what Lupin wore during the series. This gave us the first outing of the Gentleman Thief in 1971. Adapted from Monkey Punch's manga, these first 23 episodes introduced us to the main cast, which included Lupin himself, his gunsmith sidekick Daisuke Jigen, rival swordsman Goemon Ishikawa, and his on and off love interest Fujiko Mine. The main antagonist, I guess depending on how you look at it, is Officer Zenigata, who has spent most of his career hunting down Lupin and his gang and having them arrested for the countless crimes that they've all committed. Yet, he's never actually truly succeeded. Even when he does get his chance to arrest the protags, they usually find a way to sneak out. So, who is Lupin III exactly? Well, according to Monkey Punch, he's supposed to be the grandson of the original Arsène Lupin, and carries on his legacy of being a master thief. That's all you really have to know about him. Daisuke Jigen is just a friend, an epic marksman who can shoot with style. Goemon Ishikawa? He has some rivalrous encounters with Lupin, but ultimately they become good friends. And Fujiko, well, she's also a thief too, and usually she finds herself allied with Lupin for mutual interests. They do like each other, but throughout the rest of the series it just goes to show that their perilous lives don't really allow for them to settle down. So I would say they have a bit of a complicated relationship. Each character had their own unique backstories, skill sets, and, well, character that they brought to the table. This allowed the creators to have interesting stories to play around with, while still keeping the focus on the biggest protagonist, Lupin himself. Part 1 is actually pretty dark. They really managed to capture the more adult-oriented themes and violence from the manga. Unfortunately, this series was not as popular due to this darker tone. I would say if you want to understand how the characters function, you could totally watch Part 1. It's just that in my opinion, I definitely think there's a better show to watch first. In 1977, a new series came out. This series, known as Part 2, or the Red Jacket series, is not necessarily the second part chronologically. You don't need prior knowledge from the first part to understand what's going on. In fact, I would say this is a great starting point. The dark themes from the first part are toned down, but the stories in these episodes are definitely much more entertaining. This 155 episode runtime is perhaps the most consistent and glorified story of the entire series. Take for example episode 145, Wings of Death, Albatross. Lupin, Jigen, and Goemon are having a nice dinner in their trailer. Suddenly, Fujiko breaks open the door, ruining the trailer, and mercilessly gets gunned down by several thugs. Fujiko unfortunately gets captured, but leaves Lupin a detonator to an atomic bomb, prompting the group to understand the situation. I haven't really explained the whole episode, but man, there's so much adventure, intrigue, and entertainment in just the first few minutes. The animation is beautifully crafted, and also somewhat similar to something you might find in a Studio Ghibli film, and that's because the director for this particular episode, as well as quite a few others in this series, is the one and only Hayao Miyazaki. Lupin III was historically a show where he, as well as many other animators, developed their foundation for animation. Miyazaki even went on to help animate the classic movie that came out in 1979, Castle of Cagliostro. Out of any recommendations I could make for excellent starting points, this movie right here is the definitive and best place to start. This whole movie is known as one of the biggest landmarks in all of animation history, inspiring many animators across the globe, including the likes of Pixar's John Lasseter. I don't want to spoil anything from this film, but this is the best place to start with Lupin. Some people don't like this film too much because it's not necessarily true to the more darker roots of the manga, but I would say this movie is the perfect place to see if you're truly interested in Lupin III. The story elements, pacing, action, comedic timing, it's all here. This film is beautiful to watch. If you don't have the time to watch an entire 155 episode run, I would say this movie is the best way to experience all of what Lupin III has to offer. I know I said earlier, part 2 is with Lupin wearing a red jacket, yet in this film, he wears a green jacket. This is because Hayao Miyazaki animated this movie and wanted to change the perception of the darker tone that was maintained from the first part. Part 1 of the series was darker, but because of this it was not popular with audiences. Miyazaki was tasked to make the tone much lighter, and using this movie I'm sure he intended on helping getting rid of that earlier darker tone the Green Jacket series had. Some argue that because part 2 and this movie in particular are more cheerful and happy, it became less original and paved its own identity by ditching the manga's iteration. Hayao Miyazaki had become the new director and decided to change the direction, which proved to be successful in the long run. Oh, and by the way, Lupin in this movie's English dub is also voiced by David Hayter, the same voice actor for Solid Snake, but we'll get into more similarities later on. In 1984, a new series known as Part 3, or Pink Jacket series, came out. It had 50 episodes and yeah. So I'm not trying to be mean here, I personally wasn't the biggest fan of this series. They were a lot more risky with the characters in this show. The animation and character designs, especially, were very different. This is definitely the more obscure series out of the bunch. This was basically the Super Mario Bros. 2 of the franchise, if that makes any sense. There's a lot of 80s-ish kind of music, tropes, and overall aesthetic that's layered within the many stories in these episodes. There's no bad Lupin series per se, at least in my eyes, but this one definitely is not at the top for me. It has a lot of tropes established by its earlier predecessors, but at the same time, it ditches what the show was known for. The intricate and entertaining stories that the first 2 parts had are gone, and now the episodes in this part are just more mindless and boring in my eyes. I can't find any real standout episodes that made me want to come back to part 3. But I'm definitely not the biggest Lupin fan out there, and from what I have heard, this part actually does have very intricate and deep stories, but they're not as digestible as any of the stuff in part 2. And that's okay, I just personally want to watch something from Lupin, be a little of both. I liked in part 2 how there was a lot of digestible action and adventure, as well as some deeper themes that were hidden and presented themselves later on. But instead, Lupin Part 3 is mostly just very unique and has its own style that doesn't really harp it back to any other series that came before it. It's definitely good in its own right, but it's not a good place for beginners. There are definitely things to analyze in this series that aren't as obvious as the other parts, and just because of the complexity this show presents, it doesn't mean that Part 3 is bad, it's just not as entertaining as the other parts. I just want to clarify, the animation is not bad. It's more of an acquired taste that I guess I just haven't acquired. So, there was a huge time gap in real life between Part 3 and the next series, mostly filled with different OVAs, crossover movies in general, but this next series definitely played back to the roots of the initial manga. In 2012, a new series known as The Woman Called Fujiko Mine was made. This is by far the most violent and adult-oriented story for Lupin III. Not to say it's bad, because it's dark. I actually really like this series, but I would say you're in for quite a ride. It's recommended that you have some prior knowledge about the characters before you see them in this iteration. The colors are no longer vibrant, there's a lot of blood, nudity, and the overall tone is just really dark. There is this beautiful noir aesthetic that remains prevalent in every episode. This show really dives into each of the 5 characters, especially with Fujiko, Goemon, and Jigen, in more violent and mature ways. I do like my occasional dose of mature rated media, so this was definitely a blast for me, but until you have a foundation for the characters, this might not be the best place to start. But it's really up to you. It's whether or not you prefer the more darker oriented themes, or just would rather watch a more colorful and bright narrative. Either way, you really can't go wrong. This is indeed a great show. It might deter some people off though, given the violent nature. However, this definitely is more in line with the manga and fits well with Monkey Punch's original vision for the characters. Later in 2015, Part 4 came out, otherwise known as the Blue Jacket series. This show, as I've stated earlier, doesn't mean that it's the 4th part chronologically. It just means that it's the 4th iteration of Lupin. In this show, Lupin is now in the modern era, along with his 3 other companions and Interpol Inspector Zenigata. Everyone is all here. It's just now we're in a more modern time period. This show is almost like a reboot, and it's a terrific place to start if you don't want to watch Part 2 or Castle of Cagliostro. The animation is newer, and it's definitely more in line with more recent anime productions. Something interesting, in this series, for the first time, we have an ongoing plot, where the episodes are actually leading up to something. But the other episodes in the past series really didn't have this. For this show in particular, they seem to have ditched the more episodic nature that parts 1, 2, and 3 had. Instead, they went for a more serialized and ongoing plot that's very reminiscent to modern anime. This is where many people actually got into the show, yours truly. I really adored the animation and the stories they went for, especially with Goemon Ishikawa. If you want something new, with nice animation, while still having that classic Lupin style of fun, mystery, and adventure, then this is for you. You really can't go wrong starting here. Part 5, which is the most recent anime series, came out in 2018. But Lupin still wears a blue jacket in this series, and henceforth the show is also known as Blue Jacket Part 2. The animation is actually even better. For me personally, the stories in this show are perhaps the best I have ever seen played around with these characters. This show, as well as Part 4, managed to tie in more modern trends, technology, and societal standards with the classic characters. Somehow they successfully managed to pull through with this, despite Lupin being introduced 50 years ago. I would definitely watch Part 4 before this. There's a reason this show was called Blue Jacket Part 2. Part 4 and Part 5 are very connected. They both have very similar story structure and even ditch the episodic nature of the past iterations of Lupin. So if you really want interesting and deep characters, fun action-packed adventures, amazing soundtracks, man, I love that jazz in Part 2, and overall incredibly paced stories, I would say Lupin is worth the watch. If you want a good place to start, I would suggest either episodes in Part 2, the movie Castle of Cagliostro, or anything in Part 4 and Part 5. After that, if you're still interested in Lupin, then I would say it's plausible to jump into Fujiko Mine or Part 3. But I strongly recommend starting out with Castle of Cagliostro. If you like watching shows more than movies, you could always watch Part 2 or Part 4. If you like newer animation, you can watch Part 4. Otherwise, if you have no preference and you just want the best of the best, Part 2, in my honest opinion, is just a little bit better, as there is more to watch with 155 episodes and you really get a feel for the characters. Also, in my opinion, I just think Part 2 was when Lupin III was at its prime, and is the most popular incarnation for Lupin. The nice thing about these characters is that you really don't have to know much else about them. These characters are timeless, classic. Their whole design stems around the fact that time is inconsequential in the sense that there's no big chronological timeline where these shows take place. The characters are designed in a way that they can be simply plugged into different time periods and not have to suffer any continuity problems, since there's a lack of continuity. That's why Part 4 and Part 5 work. They both can act independent of the earlier parts. The characters that we know and love remain the same, but the time period and the many tools, gadgets, and knowledge can change, while their skill sets and character personalities stay preserved. Numerous shows try to do this, or maybe rewrite tiny parts of their character's backstory in order to fit in more recent iterations, such as with the Punisher, with him being a Marine in Kandahar, rather than fighting in Vietnam like in the comics. Other shows, however, throw out any continuity to try and artificially make their characters feel timeless, but these don't really work out well, especially when you've got back-to-back series that don't really get a breath of fresh air. I'm looking at you, Ash. Lupin thankfully doesn't suffer from this. Rather, the time skips that we have in real life, in between the different parts, allow for these characters to still remain fresh and classic, while not having to really worry about every little piece of continuity. Sure, there are definitely callbacks to the beginning episodes and the OVAs and the main series, but overall it really wouldn't make sense for any of these characters to remain unaged after 50 years. Instead of coming up with reasons for them to still exist in this form, they've managed to keep them classic and consistent by just keeping the characters the exact same. They don't necessarily have to reinvent the characters over and over, and can instead focus on more grand stories and villains to surround these staples. Lupin III had an incredible impact on not just the anime industry, but the entirety of animation around the world as a whole. Did you know that Shinichiro Watanabe was inspired by the characters in Lupin III to make Cowboy Bebop? This makes sense since Spike and Lupin are very similar just in design and aesthetic alone. Same goes for Jigen and Jet in terms of personalities and that sidekick routine that they both share. Fujiko and Faye Valentine, well, do I need to say anything else? I mentioned earlier that David Hayter voice acted Lupin. He also voice acted Solid Snake in games like Metal Gear Solid and Super Smash Bros. Brawl and Ultimate. However, the similarities don't end there. The character for Solid Snake was actually inspired by Lupin III. Hideo Kojima himself stated in an interview that he wanted Snake to Metal Gear Solid to be this sharp-tongued, Lupin III-like guy who flirted with women and told lots of jokes. But let's forget about Japan for a second. The Simpsons actually directly references a scene in the movie Castle of Cagliostro. I keep mentioning that movie. I'm telling you, it's a great movie. Anyways, if a show like The Simpsons found inspiration from it, you know it's good. In Season 8, the episode titled Bart After Dark has a scene where Bart falls off a roof, which is very similar to this one. But by far the weirdest reference I've ever heard, and I laughed my ass off when I heard about this, Lupin III was actually going to get a new spin-off in the mid-80s called Lupin VIII, which would take place in the future with cyborgs and a more scientific kind of feel. But due to financial and copyright disputes with the estate of Maurice LeBlanc, you know, the guy who made the original Lupin, this never came to reality, so the show was retooled and redesigned into what is known as Inspector Gadget. That's funny. There are so many random references. I was just playing Smash Ultimate the other day, and I decided to try out Joker. I love Persona 5, but I'm not the biggest fan of playing as Joker in Smash. I don't know, I'm more of a projectile guy. But as I was playing Joker, I remembered that when he summoned his persona, he called it Arsene, which is the same name as the original Lupin. And now that I think of it, in Persona 5, Joker lives at Cafe LeBlanc, and the guy who takes him in is Sojiro Sakura, who has a resemblance to Jigen. His car is even similar to Lupin's. And also, Goemon is another persona in Persona 5. Damn, Lupin's everywhere. I could go on with many more impacts that the franchise has had, but I think I've made my point. Over the past 50 years, the show really has shaped anime as a whole, and inspired so many famous and influential people to become animators themselves. It's strange that no one really talks about this show, even though it's had such a huge impact. Why isn't this show up there? Why don't people talk about it in the States? No one has really heard of the show in America, and it's unfortunately due to many reasons. The one complaint is that it's too intimidating. There's 55 installments of the anime spread across movies, TV specials, shows, and the OVAs. Western perception of anime is based on shows like Bleach and Dragon Ball. These anime shows have overarching serialized stories. This makes the series even more daunting than it already is, because a lot of people assume there's an official order you have to watch Lupin in. Not that I'm making any judgments here, but outside of the anime community, there's definitely less of an appeal for this kind of show. Even within the anime community, people have heard of it. It's just that people aren't eager to get into it. It's too damn intimidating. What a lot of people don't realize, and I've said this countless times, there is no official storyline. These are timeless characters, and worlds that are paved to fit them more so than anything else. Many people don't want to sit through the older animation, and want something more serialized. Also, people are just different across the world. In Japan, you can make shows that depict smoking, alcohol, and occasional swearing, and still market it for kids. But in America, you really can't do that. Lupin unfortunately really got screwed over by the actions that happened by past creators. Thankfully, now that anime is becoming more mainstream and gaining respect, I'm sure we're going to see Lupin III follow that path of success. It's just going to take a while. Parts 4 and 5 have definitely helped the series become better in the eyes of many, as well as many TV specials and movies. The new CGI movie looks so good, I just can't wait for it to come out. I'm not the kind of person to try and indoctrinate others into a particular fandom. When I set out to make this video, I just wanted to spread the awareness of Lupin III to people who may not have heard of it. But also, I just really like talking about the show and how entertaining it is. I find it very fascinating, and something that definitely piqued my interest a few years ago after I got into Cowboy Bebop, which is another fantastic show. That's another video for another time. The point is, I'm not sure if Lupin III is the most underrated anime out there. Given my already lacking knowledge of anime as it is, I genuinely believe that Lupin III deserves to have a higher form of respect, at least here in the West. I'm aware in Japan and Italy the series is very popular. By the way, I purposely did not mention all of the OVAs, spin-offs, and movies from the franchise. I feel like if I did, this video would be a lot longer than it already is. If you want to check out more info on Lupin, I have a link in the description that has a great guide that can help you. Also, I'm not sponsored in any way by Crunchyroll, but the best place to view all of Lupin has to be through that streaming service. You can also find Castle of Cagliostro on Netflix if they still have it. I'll put links in the description for all the parts on Crunchyroll as well. If you like this video, please subscribe, but you don't have to. Regardless, I hope you found this video very informative and helpful in case you ever wanted to get into Lupin III. Even if you're already a fan like me, hopefully this video may have helped you in some way, or at least entertained you. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.
From Scotland Yard, over.
Just casing the competition, over.
You better hand it over, over.
Why don't you roll me in the clover, over.
You go to hell! Over.